My name is Emma Hayes, and this is the story of how the coldest night of my life became the spark that built my future. I was 19 when my father looked me in the eye across the dinner table and told me I didn't belong in his house. Without a raised voice, without a second thought, he pointed toward the garage and said I could sleep there if I needed a roof. That small, drafty space became my exile. A concrete floor, a single flickering bulb, and the sound of my own breathing echoing off bare walls. I remember lying awake, shivering beneath a thin blanket, thinking that my life was ending before it had even begun. But that night planted a seed I didn't recognize at first. Every insult, every sleepless hour in that freezing garage became fuel for a quiet determination. Years later, after building a career brick by brick and saving every dollar I could, I bought the very property that once felt like my prison. Today, that same garage is a beautiful, renovated apartment, and the man who once forced me to sleep there now pays rent to me. This is how a single night of rejection turned into a life of independence, and how I turned my father's punishment into my greatest victory. I still remember the heavy stillness of that evening, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest until it's hard to breathe. My name is Emma Hayes, and I was 19 years old, sitting at the family dinner table, clinging to the last strands of hope that maybe, just maybe, my father would see me as more than a disappointment. The clatter of cutlery sounded louder than it should have, every scrape of metal and porcelain a warning of what was about to happen. My father barely looked at me while he spoke, his voice flat and unyielding. "If you need a roof, you can sleep in the garage, but you don't belong in this house anymore." The words landed like stones. My mother kept her eyes on her plate, her silence slicing deeper than any shout could have. I felt the world tilt as the meaning sank in. I wasn't just being told to leave my bedroom, I was being told I didn't belong in my own family. I gathered my few things, a duffel bag of clothes, a worn notebook, the small savings I'd hidden in an envelope, and walked down the narrow hallway toward the door that led to the backyard. The air outside was sharp with late autumn cold, each breath a visible cloud as I crossed the small patch of grass toward the garage. The garage door groaned as I pushed it open, the single overhead bulb flickering like it might burn out at any second. The smell of motor oil and damp concrete clung to everything. There was no bed, only a dusty corner where old boxes sagged against the wall. I set my bag down and sat on the floor, the chill seeping through my jeans until my legs went numb. For a long time, I just listened, to the distant hiss of passing cars, to the creak of the house where my family slept, to the quiet drum of my own heartbeat reminding me I was still alive. I pulled the thin blanket from my bag and wrapped it around my shoulders, staring at the cracked ceiling where cobwebs swayed in the draft. Fear pressed in from every side, but somewhere beneath it a faint spark began to glow. I didn't have a plan, no roadmap for how to survive, but I knew this. I would not be broken here. I whispered a promise into the darkness, a vow that one day I would walk back through the front door of that house on my own terms, not as a cast-off daughter, but as a woman who owned her life. I didn't yet know how that promise would shape my future, or that the same garage I was shivering in would one day become the symbol of my independence. But that night the seed was planted, and it would grow stronger with every hour I spent in the cold. The first morning in the garage felt like waking inside a breath I couldn't release. My thin blanket was damp with dew, and the cement beneath me radiated a cruel kind of chill that seemed to reach straight through my skin. I sat up slowly, every muscle stiff, listening for sounds from the house. The kitchen door creaked open and shut, my father leaving for work. Through the small garage window, I caught a glimpse of him, coffee thermos in hand, face expressionless. He didn't even glance toward the garage. To him, I had already disappeared. Breakfast that day was a granola bar I'd stuffed into my bag the night before. I ate it in silence, each bite dry and heavy. Hunger wasn't new to me, but the loneliness felt sharper than anything I'd ever known. My mother finally cracked the door open around noon, to drop off a folded blanket and a half-hearted reminder to stay warm. Her eyes flickered with something: pity, guilt, maybe fear. But she didn't step inside. The door shut again with a soft click that felt louder than a slammed door. As the sun set, the temperature dropped even lower. I wrapped both blankets around myself and scribbled in my notebook, my breath leaving small white clouds in the air. I wrote about escape, about freedom, about proving to myself that this wasn't the end of my story. The words were shaky and uneven, but they were mine. They gave me a sense of control, however small, in a world where I suddenly had none. Days began to blur. Each morning, I woke to the same cracked ceiling and the faint smell of oil. I started sneaking out early to a nearby coffee shop with free Wi-Fi, pretending I was just another student working on assignments. I applied for small jobs on borrowed laptops, anything that might give me enough money to survive. The first call came sooner than I expected, a cashier position at a grocery store a few miles away. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a door. And right then, I needed any door that opened. When I told my father I'd found a job, he barely nodded. "Good," was all he said, his tone carrying neither pride nor warmth. I should have been crushed, but instead, something hardened inside me. If he wouldn't give me recognition, I would give it to myself. I worked every shift they offered, stocking shelves, cleaning aisles, saving every dollar in a hidden envelope. Every coin felt like a step away from that cold garage floor. The nights were still brutal, wind rattling the thin metal door, my breath fogging in the air. But my resolve grew stronger with every passing hour. Each shift at the store was a reminder that I had value, even if my father refused to see it. Every paycheck was proof that I could build a life beyond his walls. And somewhere deep down, I began to understand that survival wasn't just about enduring the cold. It was about transforming it into fuel. I didn't know it yet, but the small stack of paychecks I was saving in secret would become the first bricks of something much bigger. Those dollars weren't just money. They were freedom, waiting to be shaped into a plan that would one day change everything. Winter settled over the neighborhood like a heavy blanket, pressing icy fingers through every crack in the garage walls. Nights stretched long and restless, but instead of sleeping, I began to fill the hours with something more than survival. My name is still Emma Hayes, but each night in that cold space, I felt myself becoming someone new. Someone quietly planning a way out. I used the grocery store paychecks to buy a secondhand laptop from a pawn shop, its keys shiny from years of other hands. By day, I stocked shelves, but by night, I sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, the blue glow of the screen reflecting off dusty walls as I taught myself everything I could about small business management, online marketplaces, and real estate basics. My fingers ached from typing in the cold, but the light of the screen felt warmer than any blanket. When the wind howled against the garage door, I sketched ideas in my notebook. Tiny side hustles, online sales, cleaning services, anything that might give me just enough leverage to climb higher. My first attempt was laughably small, selling handmade candles I poured into thrift store jars. I burned my fingers on hot wax, packaged each candle with scraps of ribbon, and sold a few at a local flea market. The profit barely covered the cost of supplies, but it lit something inside me. Failure wasn't the end, it was practice. One night, as I typed late into the hours when the world felt suspended, I overheard a conversation drifting from the kitchen window of the house. My parents were discussing finances. My father's voice was tight, edged with frustration. My mother mentioned a plan to downsize if things got worse. The word rattled inside me. Downsizing meant they might sell the house, and with it, the garage that had become both my punishment and my training ground. At first, panic clawed at my chest. What if they sold everything before I had a chance to build my escape? But then another thought followed, quieter and sharper. If they were willing to sell, it meant the property wasn't untouchable. If someone could buy it, why couldn't that someone be me? That night, I couldn't sleep. I ran numbers in my head, calculating every paycheck, every expense, imagining a future where I owned the very walls that were supposed to break me. I didn't yet have the money, the credit, or the experience, but I had the one thing my father never expected from me: relentless determination. As I closed my laptop and wrapped myself tighter in the blanket, a new promise formed in the dark. I would not only escape this garage, one day I would hold the deed to it in my own name. What my father meant as exile would become the foundation of my independence. The thought warned me more than any heater could. The garage hadn't just become my shelter, it had become my classroom, my office, and my quiet rebellion. Every cold night, every sleepless hour was now an investment. And though I didn't know how, I knew this: the walls around me would one day belong to me, and to me alone. The first signs of spring crept into the air, but inside the garage, the chill still lingered like an unwelcome memory. I had survived an entire winter in that space, and something in me had hardened and sharpened with the cold. My name is Emma Hayes, and by now, I was no longer the scared girl who first stepped onto this concrete floor. I was a planner, a dreamer, and, though my father couldn't see it yet, a builder of my own future. My grocery store paychecks were small, but each one felt like a brick in an invisible wall I was constructing between myself and the life my father had forced on me. I opened a savings account in secret, depositing every dollar I could spare. Sometimes I'd sit in the bank lobby after making a deposit, imagining the numbers on the screen as stepping stones across a river I refused to drown in. Late at night, when the house lights went dark and only the faint hum of the street lights kept me company, I drafted plans on my laptop. At first, they were just messy spreadsheets: income projections, rental property research, small business ideas. But slowly, they began to form a roadmap. I read every free ebook I could find on budgeting and property acquisition, my eyes aching from the glow of the screen. One evening, while scrolling through local community posts, I saw a flyer for a small business workshop at the public library. The words "Start where you are" jumped out at me. I showed up wearing my one clean button down, clutching a borrowed notebook like a lifeline. The room was filled with people older, more experienced, more polished than me, but I listened to every speaker like they were handing me pieces of a key. I took notes on credit building, low interest loans, and the quiet power of networking. A week later, armed with new knowledge and a fragile kind of confidence, I applied for a scholarship to a local community college's business certificate program. I wrote the application late at night, the garage air thick with the scent of spring rain and motor oil. I told my story in careful, honest sentences: how I'd been pushed out, how I was determined to build something of my own. I half expected rejection, but when the acceptance email arrived, I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was permission to move forward. The classes were small but intense, and I juggled them with my grocery shifts. I studied marketing, accounting, and real estate basics until the numbers began to dance in my head. There were nights I returned to the garage after midnight, exhausted but exhilarated, my notebook stuffed with ideas. Slowly, a more ambitious plan began to take shape, not just to escape the garage, but to own it. One of my instructors mentioned an upcoming foreclosure auction for several local properties. The words lit a spark inside me. I didn't have nearly enough money yet, but I started tracking listings, attending open houses, learning the language of buyers and sellers. I knew it might take years, but the seed was planted. I would buy this property, not as a tenant or a child, but as its rightful owner. Back at the house, my father remained distant. His indifference was both a curse and a gift. He barely noticed the envelopes of bank statements I kept hidden beneath my blankets. Each statement showed growth, a slow but steady climb toward independence. Each number whispered a quiet truth. I was no longer at his mercy. The garage had been meant to contain me, but now it was my launch pad. Every class attended, every dollar saved, every late night spreadsheet was another step toward the day I could stand on this concrete floor, not as an exile, but as a woman who owned every inch of it. And deep inside, I began to imagine the look on my father's face when he learned that the place he had cast me into would one day carry my name on its deed. That vision fueled me more than any heater ever could. It was no longer just survival. It was a blueprint for escape, and I was determined to follow it brick by brick.